A Skeptic's Path to Enlightenment is a nonprofit organization supported entirely by your donations. If you've ever enjoyed one of our podcast episodes, classes, or community, please consider supporting us with a contribution of any size right now on our website at skepticspath.org. I'm Scott Snibbe, and this is A Skeptic's Path to Enlightenment, where we share practical ideas from Buddhism to build happier lives, stronger relationships, and a better world. If you're someone who's enjoyed our podcast or classes, I want to tell you about something new that we've started, a community called Train a Happy Mind. At Train a Happy Mind, I lead a weekly guided meditation, offer classes, and have discussion forums to talk about topics from the How to Train a Happy Mind book and each week's podcast episode. You can join for free or by donation by visiting trainahappymind.org. A couple months ago, I was in New York City for a conversation with Paul Miller at the Rubin Museum for the release of my recent book, How to Train a Happy Mind. Paul is an old friend who'd be famous enough for his incredible pioneering work with collage hip-hop music as DJ Spooky. But he had so many other identities: as an author, a public intellectual, an artist, and someone with a relentless passion for one of my favorite things in life, friendship. I'll let the Rubin Museum's Tim McHenry carry on with the rest of the introductions, which he did so eloquently.
So thanks for coming out to the Rubin, everyone. I'm Tim McHenry. I'm a Deputy Executive Director here, and I'm very happy to see you, but I'm also happy because you're going to experience some transmission, I think, of clarity about what happiness actually means and how we might train our minds to be happier minds. Actually, who can claim a happy mind at this very moment? Thank you for volunteering. We'll put that to the test later. Most of us think we're happy for a minute and then suddenly decided we're not. And the consistency of actually being content and balanced with whatever might happen to you, and register that you can actually see it for what it is and how it's connected to this, that, and the other, and understand its relative being is really a skill. And that's why we're so literally happy to be able to celebrate Scott Snibbe's book, How to Train a Happy Mind, tonight, because it's something that we can all do, and we don't have to go through the hoops of a cultural, religious context in which to find it. Scott has really pared it away to its basic sort of ingredients, as it were, and practices that allow anyone, regardless of their background, to be able to, yes, recalibrate their minds so that they can less be, oh, why is this happening to me, than realize, oh, it's just happening. Right? And that distance, that realization is something that's really useful and will be increasingly useful in what may end up being an increasingly polarized and fractious world. So I'm really pleased to welcome Scott here for the first time to the Rubin. It's subtitled A Skeptic's Path to Enlightenment, and that is also the name of the podcast that he issues, which does this on a regular basis. But to have it in writing, in a book form, this is the first time, and thrilled that it is. And you will get to learn some of its contents and hopefully take a copy home, a signed copy home with you this evening. So Scott is going to be in conversation with, I don't know how best to describe Paul Miller, other than that he is a polymath. There's nothing he hasn't done or may yet want to do. His mind is that curious. And you may know him as DJ Spooky, and you may know him sort of behind a turntable, but he's just as happy in a physics lab as he is behind a turntable. The intersection of science and sound is kind of his sweet spot, and he continues to work in this field. his books, Rhythm Science, published by MIT, or The Book of Ice, published in 2011, really speak to this endless curiosity about how things work and how things can work to your better understanding if you just understood it. And so this conversation between Paul and Scott, I think, is going to be a really stimulating one. So let's welcome Scott Snibbe and Paul Miller to the stage to hear happiness. Thank you, guys.
All right.
Hey,
Nice
good to see you, Scott. Well, first and foremost, I want to just say thank you guys for coming out. I know it's Friday, and happy Friday. And here we are talking about happiness on a Friday. Let's jump in, shall we?
All right.
So me and Scott have known each other a long time, and I want to begin with a quick couple of just autobiographical things to kind of give people a sense of your evolution over the last several years. You're a graphic designer, an entrepreneur, and above all, a kind of a conceptualist. Some of your most well-known projects are you did the graphics for Björk's album Biophilia. That was wildly popular. You also did a series of initiatives with Philip Glass, and I think Beck, maybe?
Yeah, he produced, it was a remix album of Philip Glass's work, and then we did an app album where every song was interactive.
So he's also worked with Facebook over the years, and now is an independent author, and I believe this is your first book, right?
First book.
Yeah. So where you said you're from New York. Give me the Scott beginnings. Like how did you come to get into graphics?
Well, I was born in New York City. When I was 10 years old, we moved to California, and we had a special class where they took us into a room where they had these Apple II computers and a language called Logo, where you could make your own. They had this thing called a turtle. It was turtle graphics. You could say go forward, go left. And after about a couple hours with that, I thought, that's what I want to do with my life. My whole life, I wanted to be some combination of like an artist and an inventor. And then I also had a very deep, like, spiritual yearnings. I have an odd spiritual background because I come from a Jewish background, mostly Jewish family, but I was raised as a Christian Scientist, which is a very a niche religion where you don't go to the doctor. So luckily I survived that.
Wow.
Yeah.
What section of New York did you grow up in?
Upper West Side.
Upper West Side,
I was
okay.
born. And then it was like West 70s. Oh, right near where John Lennon and Yoko Ono
The Dakota,
lived.
right?
Yeah, one block off of that was my first 3 years of my life.
Okay. So amusingly enough, your evolution coming out of graphics, coming out of conceptual art, you've had adjacent stuff to like the Museum of Modern Art. Graphics have been presented in many major museums. Where did that lead you to this idea of happiness? Because I know that's a big leap, but graphic design and then happiness.
That's actually a really good question. So what people labeled my work was usually interactive art, software art, art that's made through code. But my main goal with people's minds in my artwork has always been to get them so involved in the experience that they were not thinking about the past, usually regretting it or rewriting it, not anticipating the future, like what you want, but totally present in the moment. And so it's a good question you ask, because I think it does relate very much to what both science and Buddhism say happiness is, which is when you're focused on the present. Like they've done study. Now that once they had cell phones, they started doing these studies to figure out what happiness is. And so they just buzz someone on their cell phone and say, what are you doing? How happy are you? And what are you thinking about? And so it turns out that if you were thinking about what you're doing, in general, you are happy. Whether or not that's necessarily a happy activity. So like, if you were making love, but you were thinking about work, like you were not happy, for example. But if you were in an argument and you were really present for it and engaged with that person, in some ways people would say, oh, I'm resolving something. So that's mindfulness. That's what they call mindfulness, is like, if you're actually focused on what you're doing, that is the number one cause of happiness. There are some exceptions, obviously. You don't want to be like, you can be laser focused on killing somebody, and that's not, the happy moment. But in general,
I want to unpack some of those things, because if you think about it, here we are in the 21st century. America is actually, there's a series of studies that have shown America's happiness is declining. It's called the Happiness Index. And amusingly enough, one of the happiest countries on earth is Finland. Who would guess? But having been to Helsinki, that's one where you're like, okay, where is the happiness? I'm not. But
behind closed.
Yeah. But the funny thing is we're looking at this era of the quantified self.
Yeah.
And the notion that algorithms, these platforms, they thrive on keeping you engaged. So, for example, when you see clicks and likes, you get dopamine, serotonin, other kinds of neurotransmitters that keep you engaged because if you get an Amazon package, you get happiness. The neuroscience of that is really intriguing. But with your book, it's about analytic meditation. Mm-hmm. And when you say analytic meditation, normally for the audience, that would probably sound paradoxical, like analyzing something to then meditate on it. But do you want to riff on that for a second? Because happiness in our era, one could argue we're in this era of anxiety, there's all these wars, and there's been wars throughout history, but other cultures have dealt with happiness through philosophy. For example, like the ancient Greeks, the Stoics, Aristotle had this idea of happiness as this notion of the greater good, and he felt it was a full-on constant state of being, which one could argue influenced the West for centuries. But with yours, you're kind of pivoting to more of a synthesis between East and West. And I was wondering, you want to unpack that for a second?
Sure. So it's like, what is happiness, right? So really, this whole tradition, in this book, I'm quite an authentic practitioner of Tibetan Buddhism. I studied for about 25 years, with Tibetan and Western teachers. And what this does, it takes 1,000-year-old sequence, an ancient sequence that, is said to lead you to the greatest possible happiness, but updates it for a modern audience, for people who don't believe in karma, a rebirth and other realms, which are core principles of at least Indo-Tibetan Buddhism. I gave a talk a few weeks ago and someone was arguing that they didn't want to be happy, but as a Buddhist, you often wake up and this form of Buddhism it comes from is called Mahayana Buddhism, where it's very focused on other people. And that's what the Dalai Lama, he says very simply, he says even be selfish. The Dalai Lama says, sure, be selfish. But if you want to be selfish, be intelligently selfish. The true cause of happiness are from cherishing others. Being kind, thinking well of others, not to mention being kind to other people. Mm-hmm. And so that's an experiment each of us can run in our life. Try one day being a jerk to everybody and see how you feel at the end of the day. Try one day where you're absolutely kind to every single person. How do you feel about yourself at the end? So the perspective from this book and the Tibetan Buddhist tradition I come from is that the causes of happiness are being kind to everybody, including yourself, which we can talk about. And that's the place where most people actually have the most problems, is being kind to themselves. And then what is happiness, And from this Buddhist perspective, it's not pleasure. I think that's where we get duped a bit by advertising, because advertising and our culture in general is always saying, if you just get this one thing, you'll be happy. But for those of us most of us have gotten that one. In fact, we've got thousands of those single things, and none of them made you permanently happy. And that's often when people come to a tradition like this. It's like, what are the real causes of happiness? And so other words for it, some people have a little beef with the word happiness. Other words are satisfaction, self-respect, contentment, even bliss. But a feeling of really being at peace with yourself, satisfied with yourself, and appreciating, all that reality has to offer with all its flaws. And that actually ends up, it's not a Pollyanna-ish kind of happiness. It's a happiness where you can go out and face the world's problems without getting completely overwhelmed and burnt out and depressed.
In the book, there's a kind of a constant theme that comes back of this idea of embracing impermanence.
Yeah.
And one of the things I found very charming about that is that, okay, on one hand, you have this notion of analytic meditation, which I want to circle back to that for a second, because when you think of meditation, you think of giving away to nothingness, to kind of clearing the mind. And I do Vipassana meditation about once a year. We were talking about this earlier. And it's the one time of the year I don't have to think about language, and you kind of you don't speak for basically 10 days. And there's a beauty to that. I feel supercharged when I'm done. It's this incredible sense of rejuvenation. But with your style of meditation, I'd like to give you, how would you walk the audience through what is an analytic meditation?
Yeah. So most people only know of one form of meditation. In this tradition we come from, it's often translated as stabilizing meditation. It's well known as mindfulness meditation. So that's the kind of meditation where you focus your mind. It is typically on the breath, is usually the object. And the point is to train your concentration so you can focus, and also to diminish your reactivity so that you can watch things pass through your mind without necessarily reacting to them. Now, from this tradition that comes from Tibetan Buddhism, that's actually a very tiny part of meditation, and the vast majority of other meditations are what we call the analytical meditation, where it's almost the opposite. You're deliberately cultivating thoughts, feelings, emotions that steer your mind. So the definition of meditation in this tradition is thoughts that steer your mind toward virtue. Another way to say it that I'd say in the book is thoughts that bring out your best qualities. Like that's the purpose of meditation, at least from this tradition, is to bring out your best qualities. Qualities like kindness, generosity, patience, resilience, compassion, love, and so on. And the way that happens is like telling a story. So analytical meditation involves a couple of different things, but it's emotions, storytelling, and also critical thinking. So you're deliberately cultivating constructive emotions. You're using thoughts to do that. You deliberately bring up thoughts of like thinking about other people's good qualities, thinking of your good qualities, many other types of thoughts. And then critical thinking. So analyzing your thoughts and saying, okay, is this thought something that brings about happiness, that makes me feel good, for lack of a better word? Or is this a thought that makes me feel worse and leads to a worse life, a worse world? That's a quick summary of what analytical meditation is.
Amusingly enough, there's a term that's becoming popular. You keep hearing this term, toxic happiness. It has to do with the age of the internet, where people are essentially always looking at everyone else's posts and so on. So you get this sense of anxiety, being left out, not necessarily. In fact, there's a lot of studies that show the more you look at social media, it's a very depressive quality to it, because your brain is processing. But again, it's sort of a neuro-linguistic loop. And I'm fascinated with how, with your book, you break the loop.
So the thing you described as toxic happiness, in Tibetan Buddhism, we would call that jealousy. It's actually not.
Right.
It's actually not happiness at all. And that's when you look at someone and you feel bad because you want what they have. So normally we would call that jealousy, and that's one of these like 5 root delusions, things that make you feel awful and make your life worse. And the antidote to it, luckily there's an antidote to every delusion. So the antidote to jealousy is rejoicing. So there is a way to scroll social media and to be happy, although I think even Buddhism wouldn't recommend doing it more than like an hour a day or something. But a little bit is fine. And that would be to rejoice. You see other people, it's like, felt great, wonderful. They're giving a talk tonight at the Rubin. Good for them. Good for them. But yeah, we don't tend to post on social media, our bad days. And that's the problem, because compassion comes from seeing other people's suffering. So we're often depriving people of developing that other important positive skill of compassion by not sharing, the things that are painful and ways of getting over them on social media. That was the first thing you asked about, but I don't know if you wanted to go on to that.
Yeah, the happy American, or the unhappy American, because we're declining in the happiness index, by the way.
Yeah, okay. So that one, and again, nothing I'm saying is my ideas. Like, look, I have these wonderful teachers that come through the Tibetan tradition. This 2,500-year-old analysis, it was true back then when the Buddha first taught it, is that we don't understand the causes of happiness. That we think that the causes of happiness are outside of yourself. And of course there is a baseline. Like you cannot be some contented guru if you don't have food, if you don't have shelter, if you're, racial, gender, etc. oppression. Like you need some baseline of safety and security in your life to have the luxury of talking about some of the things we're talking about right now. But then once you do, you see a lot of people who do have some level of safety and security are still not happy. This is when a lot of people often come to a spiritual path of some sort, usually when they're like 30 or something. They get a little bit of the things the world said would make them happy, and then they're like, wait a minute, this isn't doing it. Even having a nice partner, a nice home, a job that you like, some money in the bank. And then that's when you start to realize, there's some other causes of happiness. And in general, we don't learn that in school. So that's the main problem, is believing the causes of happiness and suffering are outside of yourself. And there is some contribution from external, but primarily, it's internal. And there's a very famous story from the Buddha. There's these 2 arrows that hit you, say, when something goes wrong. The first is the event, something bad happening, like say you see something awful on the news, or something someone says to you. And that genuinely hurts. The second arrow is often the one that hurts much, much worse, is the story you start to tell yourself about it, what we might call rumination. And it grows and it grows and it grows in your mind, with your family often, sometimes with a partner or an ex-partner. And that one is the avoidable one, they say in Buddhism. That is the one that you can apply antidotes to, so that you don't ruminate and tell yourself a story for days, months, years that ruins your whole life. And so these techniques are particularly useful in that, in kind of quickly processing and letting go of pain, and then doing something productively about it.
I'm a big fan of this idea of replication. Like in science, if you do an experiment, you need to be able to replicate it. So, for example, David Lynch, I'm sure you know about his meditation institute. They did a series of studies that showed if you taught people how to meditate in prison, for example, violence decreased, with a lot of veterans returning from America's various wars. They would teach veterans how to meditate, and that also helped them get over what you call post-traumatic stress disorder. There's a lot of very serious neuroscience about how the brain reformats with meditation, and you touch on that as well a little bit. I mean, I'd love to.
This is kind of amazing, because this is something the Buddha was like a neuroscientist, and something he said was that, I like, a friend of mine put this in beautiful modern terms. She said, increments of positive thought lead to happiness. Increments of negative thought and action lead to unhappiness. Like, that's the fundamental Buddhist view, is like, it's moment by moment. And we're lucky to live in this current time, because that's been validated only in the last 20 years by the principle of neuroplasticity, which says exactly the same thing. They often use a kind of a joke to summarize that field, where they say, neurons that fire together wire together, which means like every time you think something, you do something, the more you're inclined to do it. I think we've all had that feeling too, like the first time you did something very aggressive, or the first time you did something very gentle. There's sort of like a powerful moment the first time it happens, and then there's a groove where you're more and more likely to do it. And so you reinforce those thoughts. But I'm telling you, it's not. I walked around New York all day today, and having gone through this training for 25 years, everybody looked really nice to me.
Okay.
And even this homeless guy, so I'm like yelling at some people. You know how there's some people trying to have a cup of tea, and a homeless guy yelling at them, and I kind of went over to him, put my arm around him, and he's like, "What's wrong with you, white guy?" But he did stop bothering those other people, and I kind of walked away, and smiled at him. And still, I thought he was quite nice, a little bit mentally ill, but that's good at heart. That's
a leap of faith. It's a leap of faith. And to me, at fundamental heart, I mean, Buddhism is a philosophy rather than a religion, by the way. So we always have to think about this idea of thought tools. And again, I'm not Buddhist. I'm just Buddhist adjacent. I celebrate it. I find it really fascinating. So, by the way, I do want to let the audience know you had the Dalai Lama write the introduction to the book.
Yeah.
And the Dalai Lama's kind of really giving a really beautiful overview of some of the issues around Buddhism and science. But when you're kind of going through several of the chapters, the theme that comes back that I've noticed from the Dalai Lama going straight through the rest of the book is this idea of the mind is always focused on neuroplasticity, and that's something that these feedback loops you can change. I firmly believe that everything from addiction to unhappiness, those are learned things that can be, neuroplasticity can kind of evolve, and that's where critical thinking and tools like your book are very helpful. How did you... If I wanted to ask you like a philosophical overview, I mean, Aristotle has a certain sense of happiness. The American Constitution is a document of certain ideas of the Enlightenment and happiness. What would you say is a 21st century update for that? Like moving a little bit.
There's a lot of great things about the Enlightenment. It gets the Western Enlightenment. It gets a bad rap these days for some good reasons, because you got like colonialism coming out of it. But the nice things about it was that it was, it was coming out of feudalism. Like basically, everyone was the subject of the king. And so out of Enlightenment, you got the ideas of democracy. I'm not saying these were perfect, but the ideas of democracy, universal human rights, equal protection under the law, and private property, interestingly. And so the first three are imperfect, but those are all ideals like we definitely aspire to, and it's a lot better than feudalism. Private property is the weird one, because it was a solution to a problem at the time, because no one was allowed to own anything except the king. So people were kind of upset because the king owned all their stuff, all their land. He could take anything whenever he wanted it. So that's why people wanted this idea of private property. But like a fundamental core idea of Buddhism is that it's not even possible for anyone to own something. This gets to the most advanced topic of Buddhism that they call, emptiness. That we're in a continuum, that we're really, at best you can say you're taking care of something. Let's say you own a house. You don't really, of course, because first of all, you have a loan, so you don't really own it. Second of all, when you die, of course, it belongs to somebody else, or when you sell it, or it gets repossessed or whatever. So that idea, I think, is one of the biggest problems with enlightenment. It's one of the nice things about communism, actually, is this idea that people shouldn't own things. Again, imperfectly implemented in current communist states. But that's one issue with the Enlightenment. The bigger is this private property. I think we could potentially evolve beyond private property to see that we're more in a continuity with our possessions, the way more indigenous traditions saw that we're stewards and caretakers and part of nature. One of the biggest problems is that we think we're separate from nature, but we are part of nature.
There's a really good book and that I would recommend after you've read Scott's book, by the way, highly recommend it. Alain de Botton has a book called The Architecture of Happiness. And it's a British philosopher. And I think you're up in the same league, in the same sensibility. It's just obviously architecture is much more about form versus formlessness. But there's an architecture of mind. And I think, by way of my last question, and then we're going to open up to the audience, is happiness is a practice. I mean, and that's, I think, a part of the book that really left an imprint on me, is that we, in our society, there's so many things that we're in this era of the quantified self, how many followers you have, how many miles you walked, what's your update on whatever social media platform, how many clicks, likes, whatever. But the idea that America is becoming more and more an unhappy place is very clear. Let's do a closing thought on that. Skepticism for an unhealthy world. What do you think?
Well, the perspective, again, not even backed up by science now, is that happiness is a skill you can train. And as you become more happy, you actually also embrace the suffering around. You're not just blithely, walking past all the suffering in the world and ignoring the wars and injustice. I mean, I'm sure we've all felt this feeling, maybe even today, just totally overwhelmed by the suffering in the world and just wanting to kind of blot it out some way. This true form of happiness that is a skill you can train gives you the energy to really be a force for good in the world continuously, and to be happy even through watching a war, even through seeing injustice, to see that. You see, how do you make other people happy? It's often by being happy. That's one of the things. We all know people that walk into a room and they make, just their presence makes other people happy. And maybe a lot of you are that kind of person. You're actually this kind of person. Sometimes.
I'm working on it.
A lot of the time. So it's that's the thing. One of the best ways to make other people happy is to be happy yourself. One of the nicest things you can do, and it doesn't have to be big heroic acts, just smiling at I have a great quote from the Dalai Lama in here where he says, sometimes I think just smiling at someone can be better than meditating, And then Thich Nhat Hanh said, sometimes smiling is the cause of happiness, sometimes happiness is the cause of smile. They both, because our body and mind are interconnected, the two things, strangely work. You can smile and make yourself happy, or happiness can make you smile. So it is a skill you can train. I'm not saying it's easy, but there's this ancient wisdom we can draw on to be happier. To be happier.
Well, so just by way of opening up to the audience, I mean, when I was reading the book, when I finished and put it down, I was reminded of a quote from the poet Rumi, who's one of my favorite poets, and he says, "Stop acting so small. You are the universe in ecstatic motion." Yeah. It's just a great way to, we're all made of particles from all of this different forms of making the self become, for lack of a better word, hyper complex. So I just want to say thank you for a wonderful book, and let's open up to questions. And Tim is here. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a great conversation.
So if we have any hands in the house, raise them, and we'll get it started.
Yeah, it's a relaxed vibe. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Yeah.
Great.
Hi, nice to be speaking to both of you. I haven't gotten your book yet, but after this conversation, everything, I definitely will because I love it. Okay. You guys have touched on something really great and an interesting topic. You had said And we all seen it. There's a lot going on in the world, in New York, in America, and the happiness index is going down. But my question to you is that, do you think that it's going down, or is it maybe getting easier to measure unhappiness with the idea of like social media and just, everything is at the palm of our fingertips and in our face. Like, when something's bad is happening. Even like something like the Citizens app, when crime is happening. So like, is it just getting easier to measure unhappiness?
I do think there is something in terms of unhappiness increasing in the modern world, and there's a wonderful phrase sometimes that says the greatest gift you can give someone is your attention. And I think we all know that. It's so lovely when someone's completely listening to you, not thinking about what they're going to say next, not trying to solve your problem. And like all of it, it's just such a great feeling. And we live in a world where, of course, attention has become very valuable and commodified, and other forms. And before that, it was television and newspapers. Even newspapers were seen as like the scourge of civilization when they first came out. For a lot of people, for that same reason, it kind of robs you of the time you have with yourself, the time you have to completely focus with others. So I do think there is something to that our attention is truly under assault, and that it takes an extraordinary amount of will and determination just to turn off the damn it's very difficult. Like, I have all the notifications turned off, but it's not easy to do that, actually. There's not just one button to do that, but there are many things about earlier society, and especially then indigenous societies, naturally promoted attention and human connection, which are the things that truly nourish people. So those are under assault by many aspects of our civilization, and they're quite difficult. You have to like muscle them out. Like, you literally, it's like you have to muscle them out on your phone, in the advertising around you, at your workplace often. Sometimes you're completely surrounded with people all day long at your workplace. You just can't get any time to yourself. Like, that's awful for people. Even just everyday life. I'm not even talking about the awful things like, homelessness, oppression, and injustice, violence, and so on. I'm talking about the everyday strains on quite well-to-do people's happiness.
Yeah, there's studies that show that happiness correlated with wealth is always a tricky variable. So, you're going to talk about a cranky or a bitter billionaire versus someone whose income caps out at maybe $80,000, and then they might have a different quality of life relationship. There's a lot of studies that show there's enough room for everybody. There's enough food for everybody. One could argue in New York City, there's an epidemic of empty spaces right now. We could have housing, but it's the political will or bad codes for the buildings, you name it. So that kind of inertia and it's unmindfulness. Yeah. And I'm fascinated. When I put your book down, I was like, there's solutions. We just need to think better. Right.
So then what can you do, right? It's good to not get, because you can get kind of lost in saying, unhappiness. But what can you do? Like, one thing I say in this book, which a modern solution that, isn't part of Buddhist wisdom, because they didn't have this problem, is first thing in the morning, don't touch your phone. Like, when you wake up in the morning, do something to connect with yourself before you pick up, because it's not usually healthy. You're seeking, attention, entertainment, work, wealth, whatever. Leave all of that alone and do something to connect with yourself, whether it's going for a run, meditating, if you like that, playing music, writing, sometimes just writing, automatic writing, like just sitting and writing whatever comes out of your head, for 10 minutes. Do something to connect with yourself, whatever that is. Everybody has that thing. Do that thing for yourself every morning, and your life, your happiness will greatly increase.
Okay, we have 2 questions to the back, which is great. Thank you.
Great.
Hi, congratulations. I can't wait to read the book.
Another friend of mine. Yeah.
I just wonder, with all this amazing knowledge and long time practice, how it's affected you as a parent, and if there's things that you've done or recommend parents doing that are kind of radically different from what you see your peers doing.
There is some Buddhist parenting advice I can share that I learned from other Buddhists and in my own experience. I mean, one is to realize that a lot of the times you feel strongly negative or controlling about your kid is just about you. Ask yourself quite deeply, like, why do I want my child to do this, and what's my agenda here? I think that's a very important one, is to really respect your child. I learned this from a friend of mine who's a high school counselor, who's a deep long-term Buddhist, is really respect the perspective of your children. And what they want and say comes from a genuine place, and they may be right. They actually may be right about what they need and what they want, and your agenda is wrong. So to honestly look at their perspective, and sometimes, you are right. The other thing is it's kind of fun, I never force my daughter to meditate or anything, and of course she loves it. Like, she comes into my meditation room, she's like, what's this? I was like, oh, when she asks. But I do kind of see some interesting philosophy, like Paul keeps talking about, some interesting Buddhist philosophy into our life. So a couple years ago, I said to her, because I felt like she was ready, her name's Samaya. So I said to her, you're not a Samaya. And she said, what do you mean? I said, that's just a sound when your body and mind slid out of your mother. I made it kind of graphic. When your body and mind slid out of your mother, we gave you that sound. We said that sound we'll use to refer to this body and mind. And it totally blew her mind. She was like, whoa, I'm not a Samaya. But you see, that kind of thing, a lot of you in the room, it might be the first time you ever thought that. It's like, wait a minute, I'm not a Scott, I'm not a Paul, I'm not a Tim. That's just a sound our parents attach to it. But what are you? So then that starts you on this incredible journey of self-discovery. You're like, what am I if I'm not a Scott? Exactly. And then you reflect on that your whole life, and you go deeper and deeper and deeper to discover what you really are, which is so much more subtle and interconnected than thinking I'm a separate Scott and not part of this world, but I walk through it and try to obtain things.
Nice, thank you for that question. Yes, we've got two hands up. Could you have two mics coming simultaneously? Thanks.
Thank you both very much. This has been really inspiring. I'm not a Buddhist, but in thinking about how we're all part of each other, which is actually a beautiful way to think about who we share the world with. I wonder about responsibility and action and where those things come in.
Yeah, this has been a legitimate critique of Buddhism that Thich Nhat Hanh had, that His Holiness the Dalai Lama had. And out of it, Thich Nhat Hanh was really the first one to unite modern social action and Buddhism with what's called engaged Buddhism. But the perspective remains the same, that social action is very, very important. Physical social action is quite important, but it pales in comparison to interaction, because you won't be effective as an activist without a mind that can really see both sides of a situation. And we live in a time where we're constantly dehumanizing the other side. You want to be on the side of humanity from a Buddhist perspective for everybody. And you want to acknowledge that everyone has the same needs, the same needs for safety, security, justice, wealth, and so on, equity. But then people take misguided strategies to meet those needs. Let's look at Vladimir Putin as an example. His country has a legitimate need for safety, security, autonomy, thriving, maintaining their culture, and so on, right? Legit. Strategy for trying to achieve that goal: invading another country, killing hundreds of thousands of people, threatening the planet with destruction. Poor strategy, right? But to be able to separate those, it's so hard. I use that example because it's so hard to think of Vladimir Putin as having legitimate human needs, but he does. And that's the Buddhist perspective, to do that with every single person, to see however insanely misguided their actions, their strategies for meeting their needs, their fundamental needs are the same. The needs for happiness.
I don't think Putin's too happy, just a guess.
He's definitely not happy. That's the thing. Here's the beauty of it. This is why it's worth having...
Just saying.
No, this is why it's worth having compassion. When you do this meditation on Vladimir Putin, wishing him happiness, right? It doesn't mean you think he's a great guy. It means you think, man, if that guy were happy, he wouldn't be invading Ukraine. He would just be nice and enjoying his country and making peace with the world, right? If he were truly happy, he wouldn't need to do those awful things.
Sure.
That's the Buddhist perspective.
I'd like to think of it maybe as a negation. The world might be a better place without him. But that's another part of the multiverse. We could say, you wake up on one side of the bed one morning and you're in a different universe.
But then that's acceptance, because we do have him.
Yeah.
And violence is never the solution in the Buddhist perspective. We can argue with that.
Yeah, I hope I'm not. Right. Please don't think I'm advocating.
But that's what we think.
Yeah.
If only we didn't have Putin, maybe someone should kill him. But that wouldn't be a cause of a better world from a Buddhist perspective. It would cause more problems in the world.
I'd rather be in a slightly different universe, just a little bit of.
But this is the universe we're in.
Yeah.
Right? So what can we do if you believe, genuinely that violence has never solved a problem, in the long run, then what do we do instead? And luckily there's many good books, and Martin Luther King Jr. really codified those principles so well that many, many activists today, still embody. A wonderful man named Kazu Hagu, who wrote a beautiful book called Healing Resistance that I'm just finishing, that just masterfully lays out how to be nonviolent and how to effectively fight injustice and violence in the world. So it is possible, and it's debatable. People can debate, but that's the Buddhist perspective.
So David had a quick question.
First of all, thank you, Tim, and the Rubin Museum for welcoming Scott and Paul. Such an interesting and informed and elevated conversation. Even just the last topic you discussed. As you know, Paul, my family comes from the Ukraine, and trying to have the capacity for forgiveness to someone like Putin, especially when the Soviet Union rescued our family after World War II, and now it's turned around. The world is crazy. I think, like many of us here, I listen to a lot of podcasts, and recently with Sam Harris and Yuval Noah Harari, I find myself having images, and at the beginning of your discussion, I saw a tennis, not a match, but like a rally where you were both trying to get the ball back to one another so it could continue. It was just so wonderful. And then the other image, which I was so surprised, was kind of a fractal. And you actually look kind of like Benoit Mandelbrot. You do. You actually look quite a bit like him. But every time you would start a topic, and then you would go deeper into it, and then something would open up, and then you go deeper into it, and the fractal in different forms will repeat itself. And I'm wondering, my question is, what's at the core of that? What's at the core of going all those layers deep, maybe Paul and you, Scott, as you try to, discover an ultimate truth? I don't know if it's infinity or if it's nothingness, but I'd love to hear what you think is that deepest fundamental level for us.
I mean, the Buddhist perspective, it's just two things. It's love and interdependence. And love doesn't mean we think love means thinking someone's really adorable and wonderful. But the Buddhist definition of love is just wanting others to be happy. It's so simple. That's how you can love Putin. I wish he was happy, because then he wouldn't be doing all those awful things, right? That's how, you don't think he's a great guy, he's not. And then interdependence, to just remember that we're not separate from each other. New York City is a great example. You depend on 10,000 people a day to get through your day, even though some of them might be a bit grumpy. Still, they're helping you. They're benefiting you. Every single person along the way is handing you, yes, you're handing them some money, but they're handing you something back and making your life wonderful with your latte and your kale salad and whatever else you enjoy, and the way you interact at work and make the world slightly better, hopefully, with what you're doing. So that love and interdependence are the two core principles.
And so to go to the heart of your question, I want to be respectful of time too, so I'm going to keep this brief. Let me give you a quote-unquote existential thing. It's where 66 million years ago, an asteroid hit the Yucatan Peninsula. There was this group of folks called dinosaurs. The dust from the Yucatan Peninsula was particularly thick. It's a wind in the air and caused a kind of a global winter and wiped out the dinosaurs. And we wouldn't be sitting here today if not for that asteroid. But if the asteroid had arrived 20 minutes earlier or 20 minutes later, it would have hit the ocean, whether the Caribbean or the Pacific, and would just landed in the water and sent a bunch of steam up. So there's a 20-minute window of time where millions of years of potentiality could have just never happened. And I love that sense of we are the asteroid now. We're kind of wiping out and causing all these problems, and we're in very cynical times, politically speaking. Whether it's Trump or Putin or Netanyahu, or you name it, all these various people who are just cynical, destroyers of things. But the tools are there to kind of deconstruct that and give people, I think, better tools for critical thinking. And that's where I think Scott's book, to me at least, was very life-affirming when I was reading it. Do you want to do that last reading?
Scott will be upstairs to sign books. So if you do have remaining questions for him, that would be a great place to do it, because I think what we need to do, as Paul intimated, is actually experience a meditation through Scott's writing, because we've heard a lot about it, but what about actually doing it together? And doing it together, right? That's significant, because we want to leave you with the experience rather than just the words. So, Scott, will you guide us through?
Sure. So we talked about what would be a good choice. This is actually slightly lighter than a meditation, but it's actually maybe more beneficial because it's, this is just a page, and it's called Everyone Walks the Hero's Journey. And it's a way that you as a New Yorker can walk down the street and see every person as a beautiful human being. So listen to this and see if it works. Everyone walks the hero's journey. From Jesus Christ to Luke Skywalker, the hero's journey is a universal structure for mythical tales of growth and adventure. But each of us is also the hero of our own life. We may rarely acknowledge it, but each of us was born, and every one of us will die. In between, we all experience our own struggles, conflicts, triumphs, and loves. As you encounter people in your daily life, a powerful meditation on impermanence is to picture the moment each one of them was born. Imagine their mother's pain, her exhaustion and joy at creating a fragile new being whose life depends on her. Then, try to imagine how that person will eventually die. Alone or surrounded by loved ones, agitated or at peace. This technique is especially helpful when you're angry with someone because it helps put your dispute into perspective. Picture the end of that person's life, in a hospital bed or at home, after a life that was long or short, a life of virtue or misbehavior, a life ending among friends or silently alone. Then, try to imagine where that person is right now on their journey from cradle to grave. What dreams, goals, and disappointments they may have had, moments of loneliness and intimacy. Without this kind of reflection, the people around you can seem like video game characters, mere obstacles or aids to your life's agenda. Such a rigid, self-centered view of the people around you is disconnecting and inaccurate. They're all constantly changing, and each of them treasures their precious lives just as much as you do yours. Each of them lives an epic hero's journey. So that's a meditation you can take into a way of thinking about every day and every person you see.
Thanks, Scott.
Thank you. Thanks for joining us for my conversation with Paul Miller, aka DJ Spooky, about my new book, How to Train a Happy Mind. The book, audiobook, and ebook are all available to purchase anywhere you buy books. If you end up enjoying it, please leave a positive review at Amazon to help others discover it. If you'd like to deepen this conversation, you can subscribe to our newsletter through the links on our website at skepticspath.org, or follow us on Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn. I'm also now offering a weekly guided meditation through our Train a Happy Mind community, which you can join for free or by donation at trainahappymind.org. A Skeptic's Path to Enlightenment is a nonprofit organization supported entirely by your donations. If you've ever enjoyed one of our podcast episodes, classes, or community, please consider supporting us with a contribution of any size right now on our website at skepticspath.org. Thanks to Annie Nguyen for production and story editing, Christian Parry for mastering, and Isabella Acebal for marketing. We wish you a wonderful day.